recently disturbance from human beings from recreational killing and hunting. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about some of the consequences of that kind of maybe not unnatural disturbance, but an increased frequency of that disturbance in the more recent past.
Well, understanding that most of these disturbances are related to what people do and humans, and often these involve killing of wolves, or in many cases, at the very least, injuring of wolves. Mm-hmm. But there are other less drastic effects, and it's just direct disturbances, things like noise or activities, recreation, industry, a whole variety of things, roads. Those also constitute disturbances that can alienate wolves away from areas where they live, or even interrupt what happens within their packs and their social orders and how they communicate with one another. So you can have very, very dramatic disturbances that, and those obviously are the ones when wolves are being killed. But this relates to the destruction of the packs, and often disturbance of the social order and the relationships within the packs, which affects how the packs operate. And that would include their ability to hunt effectively, and the areas in which they're familiar with, which they rely on that knowledge of and familiarity. Wolves are known to cognitively map the areas in which they live with a high awareness of where they can find prey, etc. That kind of information is often lost as a consequence of disturbances. So this can be really, really detrimental to wolf packs, both in the short and in the long term. It also affects their reproductive behavior in the breeding that occurs within the packs, because often you're removing prominent individuals, dominant breeding individuals, adults, which means that others have to become involved in breeding and reproduction in a way that they likely wouldn't have previously. One of the responses that we frequently see is when wolves are disturbed, particularly when these are, we're talking about lethal disturbances and loss of wolf numbers. You see changes again in reproduction and even in the number of pups that are being produced annually within the wolf pack in a response to those disturbances when wolf densities have been reduced so dramatically that they need to recover the populations. But the list of consequences is really extensive, and I mean, we could do a whole program on that, and there's more and more documentation of what those disturbances are and how those disturbances affect other species as well within the environment that the wolves live.
Yeah, and we'll probably, this is with hindsight, share some more resources and papers. We're getting a lot of questions coming through, so I just wanted to I'm just going to pick some out. So apologies, I might not do these in order, but and I'm going to try and cover ones that we will not likely to cover later. Okay, is my understanding that generally the alpha female is the most important to family group cohesiveness? Can you describe the different roles that the alpha female and male play?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is true that the dominant female, or the alpha female in this case, plays a significant role in that cohesiveness, and it's partly a role of leadership, but also in the requirements of the alpha female to care for the pups as well, and that is really a significant and important contribution. That's obvious, I think, to everybody. But just imagine that the dominant alpha female, who is the breeding female, she's also confined and constrained and in caretaking for at least 4 to 6 weeks after the pups are born. So she has a very influential role there, but she's also simultaneously at that time dependent on other wolves, which include the dominant male, that part of the question was the role of the dominant male. And it is typically observed and frequently, but not, and this isn't always the case, but the dominant male usually is instrumental and important in hunting and predation. So that's a role that seems to be common to the dominant male.
And there's another couple of questions here, and I'm going to stop apologizing for not doing them in order. There's too many, but it's an interesting question here. It's, what are the characteristics of an alpha? Are they aggressive, intelligent, empathetic? I'm kind of curious.
Well, this gets
it's such a great question for humans and for
wolves. It's a very good question. The characteristics do vary, and this is through direct observations, and I've done a lot of behavioral work. So a lot of people imagine that the dominant males and dominant females are aggressive in their behavior towards other wolves. That can be the case with some, but with others, that's not necessarily so. And you can have wolves that you might view as being really benevolent, and you would appear to be caring of other wolves in the way that they respond to them and interact with them. And these typically, as we observe wolves, both in the wild and captivity, are wolves that seem to be very, very secure in their role as dominant animals. And they don't feel the need to assert themselves. That's my impression of it, and that's an interpretation in an aggressive or a dominant way. They only express dominance in situations that are, that warranted. For example, that might be in an emergency situation when we're trying to either rally the pack or coordinate the pack, or individuals in it that are somehow interfering with what the pack might need to do. And we see this in both males and females. But so those characteristics vary. We see that again in people, and particularly I would say in politics, how politicians express themselves, and other leaders.
Yeah, there's definitely some
parallels there.
Wolves. Yeah,
there's a wonderful book that was published in, I think, the late 1970s. It's called Parallels in Evolution, and it is about people and wolves.
And Paul, I wanted to take a slightly different track, or just to also cover like this. So we talked a little bit about this huge topic about the nature of wolves and how they interact with each other. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about like their role in terms of their interaction with other species, so their ecological role. So Raincoast focuses on wolves as apex predators partly because of this role and its importance. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about their role in terms of regulating other prey species, and perhaps move into this idea of the landscape level of effects of animals like the wolf.
Sure. And we can talk about a few aspects, but clearly not all, because they have such a profound influence on the environment in which they live and on other species. And I think most people are quite aware of that. Again, it's disproportionate to their numbers. And this is why they're considered to be so important and viewed. We speak of them as a summit predator or an apex predator. So keeping in mind that various systems in which wolves live, because they're so broadly distributed worldwide, vary. And they vary by numbers of species and their own complexity. So some systems are very simple, where you just have one or two top predators like wolves and bears, or just very few prey species, maybe a deer and elk. And others are much more complex, where you have multiple prey predators. And these are major predators like wolves, bears, cougars, etc. And many prey species. So you can have elk, moose, caribou, deer, whole variety, all living in the same area. So the influence of wolves in those areas varies. But keep in mind, and we refer to wolves as having a top-down influence as opposed to a bottom-up influence. Bottom-up influence would come, for example, from plants would be a bottom-up influencer, wolves being top-down. So they have their direct influence that would be via predation primarily on prey that they're most interested in. And they can serve sometimes a regulatory role. It's not clear. There's a lot of debate about whether wolves regulate their prey or not, but that can be a regulatory role. They also interact with the other predators that are present and living in the same environment. What's interesting is they also influence the behavior of their prey as well as the other predators. And for example, in some excellent work that I think many people know about that's been done in various places, including in Yellowstone in Italy and in Canada, by influencing the behavior of their prey, in this case, we might talk about elk in Yellowstone National Park, they change, it's just an example, when and where they might, these animals might be feeding and in which area. So they influence how their own prey influence the plants, for example, that they feed on. And this can be quite extensive. And the work that's been done in Yellowstone is emphasized on aspen primarily and also willows. But you look at the redistribution of elk relative to wolves, both in time and space as a consequence of the presence. But this goes on, and you can now just imagine in your own minds that these associations and linkages continue on down the line from the prey to the predators, et cetera. It gets increasingly more complex, and it interacts with those influences coming from the bottom up simultaneously.
And Paul, there was a piece that I just kind of find fascinating as well. It's kind of intuitive in a way, but I think you kind of alluded to it. Is also this idea that it's simply the presence of wolves on a landscape that can all of the behavior of prey animals. It's not just the direct predation, but it's also the simple fact that animals are aware that wolves in some cases have returned to the landscape, and that in itself is sufficient to alter their behavior.
Yes, and this was one of the major observations with the reintroduction of wolves into the Western states and primarily to Yellowstone, where it was possible to monitor. So that what you're referring to is this landscape of fear theory, and just as you suggested, the presence of wolves alone influences their prey, and that's thought to be via fear. And I think it's important for people to understand that dynamic might change over time. And I can tell you from my own observations that in areas that wolves have recolonized more recently, and so that they're fairly novel in their presence relative to the prey or their primary prey. And again, for example, elk, the elk do behave quite differently in response to the wolves than they might in a more established situation where there've been a long-term relationship of wolves and elk. And I'll just give two quick examples. One from Wood Buffalo National Park with bison, for example, and then from Rocky Mountain National Park and with elk, where it's not uncommon for us to observe wolves and elk right in the same area, very close to one another. In some cases, I've watched wolves that are just sleeping in the middle of or near herds of elk, or within close near proximity to bison. And there's that, but there's an awareness back and forth between the predator and the prey there. And but interestingly, when wolves begin to hunt, everybody is awake. And you can watch it develop and how it manifests, as this awareness, spreads, throughout all the predators and the prey. wonderful piece that was written by Barry Lopez some years ago, and I can't remember where it was published, and it's called The Conversation of Death. And it talks about this exactly between the predator and the prey when this is happening. So I would highly recommend it if you can find that piece.
Yeah, I think we have it. I remember reading it a while ago. So we will do our best to share some resources afterwards. I'm just going to go back to a question here. I'm just trying to track some questions in text as well. That's why my eyes are all over the place. And it relates to something we discussed before and the question was, Paul, what happens when wolf packs meet? And we spoke about this the other day, and in that, like, you know, lots of people there's lots of ways of consuming information about wolves in addition to the academic papers, and we know a lot about wolves and see a lot about wolves interacting in Yellowstone, and that, you know, I guess in some ways it makes for great TV, this kind of super dramatic conflict, and that's very much by certain channels kind of amped up. And I'm kind of curious if you could say a little bit more about, like, what's, I guess there's no normal, but is that level of conflict that we see, it almost seems characteristic of wolves in Yellowstone. Is that common elsewhere?
That is a great question, Ross, and your comment that, well, there is no normal. I think that's an important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So my understanding of what is happening in Yellowstone, where we do see frequent conflict between packs and even within packs, and often that conflict results in dead wolves, and that is wolves killing other wolves. And this is really unusual as far as I'm concerned. It's not what I would say is characteristic of wolves at all. Certainly not in areas where I've studied wolves, and that's a pretty, you know, on multiple continents and different places. I know in maybe 45, 50 years of studying wolves, I've once or twice documented wolves killing wolves, and these are in pack conflicts. And this is through close on the ground tracking of wolf packs over extended periods of times. In fact, over years, you know, where we would find those kinds of events. I think partly what we're seeing in Yellowstone, and the others would have probably a different opinion on this, but I think it still is unsettled. You know, we have to be thinking in ecological timeframes rather than in our own, you know, short sort of political timeframes. That the wolves have only been present in Yellowstone and returned in maybe a little bit more than 20 years. And so it still is unsettled there. And I think that part of that unsettledness is still being worked out among the wolves themselves. And part of that might be manifesting in seeing more wolves killing other wolves. Something that we might not see elsewhere.
Yeah.
So that's my understanding of it, or my take on what might be occurring. But I would venture to say that it is atypical, and in my experience is unusual.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Paul. It's fascinating. I was gonna jump to a couple of questions, and I'm going to take a kind of random approach because the questions are very different in nature. So this question, anonymous question, but I'm kind of curious as to the answer and just the question. Is it possible for a human to enter a wolf pack as a member of a lower rank?
You know, I think we have too much fixation on rank. And unfortunately, that extends over to how we treat dogs and how we treat other people. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, people have done that, and they've joined wolf packs in various ways and with various levels of success. It doesn't mean that they're part of that wolf pack. I think in some captive circumstances that might be the case, but I don't think that they're fully recognized as a pack member, no matter how much they try to emulate the behavior of wolves. But wolves are just being accepting. And just as personal examples, you know, we've spent, you know, months and months and hours and days close to wolf packs, in following them on the ground or living at den sites with them. we weren't embraced as members of the pack, but we were certainly tolerated and you know, I would say even respected.
Yeah.
So people have done that, and you know, mostly what you've described, but I don't think it's what they perceive it to be.
Okay. There's a couple more, some feedback back from here. So we have Norman Bishop, thank you. He's telling us that Barry Lopez writes about the conservation of death at page 62 and 94 of Wolves and Men. So that's that question answered.
Well, it's wonderful. Let me just add that that was from Norman, and Norman is one of the more knowledgeable people about wolves from Yellowstone, and very much responsible for the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park. So that's wonderful to hear from Norman.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us, Norman. And I'm gonna, Paul, I'm gonna take a couple more questions, but I'm just gonna have a look. Let's have a look here. So here's a good question, I guess, and I guess this would be in the lines of maybe sometimes. How widespread is a pack's territory?
Another very good question. Of course, again, keeping in mind that wolves live in a variety of environments, including, you know, from deserts to mountains. So territory size varies tremendously. So a territory can be as small as 100 kilometers square. What is that non-metric? Somebody can translate that into a non-metric for me. And we see some territories, particularly in mountainous areas, with, you know, 2,000 and 2,500, 3,000 square kilometers. So it depends on the abundance of prey. It depends on the physiography or the topography. That's an important influence, because you can imagine in mountains, not all areas are usable by wolves. So you have a lot of unused areas. Valley bottoms are important, but mountain peaks and steep slopes are not, so they're excluded. So they end up being in much larger territories by necessity. But the density of prey and availability of prey is very important to that territoriality, and the extent of it.
Okay, there's a lot more questions. I'm just going to take some just totally at random. Would a wolf pack take in an abandoned cub or a baby of another species?
I don't know. That's a good question, whether they would adopt a species. You know, we see this happen with lions, for example, and some of the cats. I don't know that we've seen that with wolves in the wild, with the possible exception maybe of a domestic dog, but I don't know that that's been documented anywhere. Someone who's listening and might have better information on that.
Okay.
I'd be interested in a more complete answer there.
Okay. Well, the audience members here, feel free to help us out and answer this question. And here's a different question. All these questions are, I guess, would lead to lots of complex answers. But Paul, this is the question. What do you think the consequence of climate change in forestry are on wolves in a bottom-up tritrophic food chain?
Wonderful question. Well, the climate change is very important to wolves, only because they are going to be influenced by the changes that occur on the landscape or within the environment where they're currently living. So in the tritrophic sense, if we're looking at the very bottom, and that would be from the forests in vegetation, plant species, we all know that climate change is having, again, a profound influence on vegetation. And it's changing dramatically. And one of those changes that's going to be of most importance, if we want to link forests and forestry back to this, you know, a lot of what we do in forestry is predicated on the cutting of the trees and then the replanting of the trees with the anticipation or the understanding that those forests will develop again as they once were. And that's what we talk about, is they go through various successional stages until they reach a climax stage of a mature forest. And it'll be similar to what was there when they had harvested the trees originally. Well, that likely is changing. We're not going to see that. We're going to see an environment that's going to be dramatically different at that lower trophic level than what it is and was at the time that these trees were removed. This has major consequences for prey species primarily, and then hence, and obviously, for wolves that depend on those prey, because some prey are not going to be able to adapt to that changed environment that is resulting from climate change. So you can, I think, imagine what might happen in the longer term. We're going to see some species completely pushed off the areas that they once inhabited. I think wolves will do well by comparison with other species because they can adapt to the changes that occur, or if the other species, the prey species primarily have to move, for example, farther north or into higher elevations, and as the habitats change, the wolves will certainly go with them. But that's a really good question, and not one that is frequently asked and of great importance. And I would come back to caribou as being a species that's directly affected by this. And I think that there's a great misunderstanding currently with what might happen with caribou and how we can conserve them into the future.
Yeah, lots of people are asking about this, and we do plan to cover that a little bit in a later series. So I'm kind of minded not to kind of hold that question as a topic because it's so rich, and also we're seeing a lot of questions about wolves in British Columbia, and I was wondering, Paul, if so I'm going to kind of change track a little bit again, and thanks everyone for all these questions. I really appreciate it. If you could tell us a little bit about, I wanted to shift to wolves in British Columbia, and I'm kind of stepping into an awkward stage here because I also wanted to very briefly just acknowledge the fact that a lot of the way in which, and this isn't my story, it's going to be shared by my colleague Chris Darramont later on, but a lot of our work on wolves in British Columbia was really strongly influenced by a gentleman called Chester Starr, the Healthsick Nation, who sadly passed on recently. So we just wanted to acknowledge that this whole series is going to be dedicated to his memory because of the influence that he had on us. And we're going to invite colleague Chris Darramont to talk to that and to share more a little bit about Chester and his influence on our work in a later series. But I just wanted, as soon as we start to think about our work in wolves in British Columbia, it feels right and appropriate just to acknowledge Chester and his influence and just respect his memory.
And Ross, just briefly, one of the things I would add about Chester and his influence, Chester taught us how to think. And, this is of real importance, and in particular that we acquire knowledge in different ways. And I think, later Chris will be able to talk about that, but that's where his influence really has been important, and certainly in my life as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more from Chris about that. And I just didn't want to skip over it. And Paul, obviously, I think especially Chris Darramont is our science director at Raincoast, and we'll hear from him later on in the series. A key piece of Chris's work is this whole concept of consilience and this respecting and valuing these different ways of learning, these different ways of knowing, and different types of knowledge. And I'm wondering, Paul, if you could tell us a little bit about what kind of drew Raincoast and yourself towards a closer examination of or study of the coastal wolves of British Columbia. Lots of us hear about the idea of rain wolves now and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of curious if you could share a little bit more about what drew your attention and Raincoast's attentions towards the coastal wolves.
My attention started really with work that was carried out by Ian McTaggart-Cowan, who was one of the very early wolf researchers in Canada in the 30s that I was aware of, and his discussion, and he published documents that talked about coastal wolves, in particular wolves on both the mainland and the islands in coastal British Columbia. And so that always intrigued me. I didn't know very much about that, but again, you know, wherever wolves are is where I want to be, and I want to know about them because they vary and differ wherever they are. I had the opportunity and the benefit of listening to Peter McAllister. This was a number of years ago in the mid-1990s. Peter was one of the early associates with Raincoast Foundation and one of the founders. And this was in British Columbia. And part of his presentation, which was focused primarily on bears, was about wolves and the wolves that were on the coast and what he was seeing and what he was seeing on the island. And this intrigued me. You know, what is going on? These are unlike wolves that I know and the ones that he's describing and talking about. So that brought me to Raincoast and my interest in what Raincoast was doing and their interest in me and our mutual interest in wolves. Well, I was very, very lucky and had the benefit of, at the time I was working in the Southern Rockies of Canada on wolves in a wolf project. And one of the volunteers on there was Chris Daremont, who was an undergraduate at University of Victoria. And I had the luck, I would have to say, of meeting Chris. And of course, we ended up discussing a lot of things, but among those were wolves. Well, working with Raincoast and our interest in wolves and wanting to know more about them and realizing that wolves were and would provide an entry point because they are the summit or apex predator in any system into the larger system and the ecological complexities of the coast itself. We decided that we really needed to study and embark on a research project focused on wolves in particular. And the one person who, again, felt strongly could probably carry this out and do it as a graduate project was Chris Daremont. And of course, ultimately we all became one large family. But Chris then took the reins essentially and was the primary researcher and lead on the coastal wolf research and working with others, of course, but he was also the major influence in that research.
Paul, could you give us a sense, like, I guess, some of us might be familiar, like this area that we, Raincoast works across the coast of British Columbia now, but then and now a key part of our work was in this Great Bear Rainforest. So the mainland part of, for our other listeners, of British Columbia between northern Vancouver Island and Alaska, which is characterized by these islands, these coastal fjords. It doesn't have a huge population density. It's a relatively small number of indigenous communities. I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about the challenge, the scale of what Chris undertook and the challenge of doing this type of research in a different way, i.e. in a non-invasive way.
Well, there were major challenges, of course, because you're limited on what approaches you can use to study wolves. And of course, just the geography alone in the area preclude access. And we're in essentially a water environment. It's punctuated by various islands at distances between and among them and from the mainland as well. So the biggest challenge was accessibility and also having mobility in that situation. And obviously that required that we move about on water by boat and have access to that. But so that was the major challenge. The other one was one that we created for ourselves and are happy to do so. And that's it. Most of our research we like to do and make sure that it's non-intrusive. In other words, do what we can without handling the animals, and that includes the capturing and the collaring, for example, which I've done a lot of in the past, but all of our effort in the last 20 years is to be as non-intrusive as possible so that we don't affect the animals, and in this case, wolves that we're working with. These were, for most people, were major obstacles, but for Chris, it seems to be something that he embraced as a project, and developed different approaches that would allow us to study these wolves and really gather the kind of information that we were looking for. So we were able to do genetic information. We were able to determine what prey species the wolves were depending on. We worked on disease, a whole variety of things, but most of the same things that you would see from studies that are carried out elsewhere. Conducted in a very different environment, in a more challenging environment, using different non-intrusive methods.
And just for again, it's I'm sure, Paul, you could talk for days about the coastal wolves of British Columbia, and Heather, Dr. Heather Bryan's gonna join us for one of the later series, and we're gonna delve into a little bit more about their distinct genetic nature and some of the other pieces that we've looked at. I'm kind of coming in there, Paul, just because we've got about 6 minutes left here. So I was going to try and just flick through some of the questions. Well, in fact, there was a question that came to my mind. I'm going to be careful with how I ask it, just in terms of the safety of wolves and people. So someone's asking the question, if there is a family or group of wolves living close to where they are, and this seems as a real question, I'm not going to say where, how can we convince people not to fear them? Or I think another aspect of that question that somebody else asked is, if people are living in proximity of wolves, which is obviously the case in many parts of the world and here in BC, what might they be able to do to effectively coexist and manage that risk and that interaction?
Well, certainly coexistence is what the goal is, obviously. First of all, is to be respectful. And that means don't be intrusive and don't try to interact. I think that's primary advice that I would give. Secondly, you want to be living in and keeping a clean environment, and not dissimilar from what you would do living in an environment where bears are present, and other wild animals. So by that, that means controlling all of your garbage and access to food, etc. All the attractants that might bring in wolves into an area. But the key primarily is avoidance and, again, mutual respect. And typically what you see in that sort of situation is that both wolves and the people tend to avoid each other but accommodate one another. And I think that's really the goal. In particular is, we deprive wolves more and more of the environment in which they depend on, and their life requisites as the human populations continue to expand and become increasingly more disruptive.
Yeah. And Paul, I've seen a lot of questions here. I'm sure, many of our audience here will know of the story of Paquet, this in inverted commas lone wolf that lived on an island just off Victoria. And I know Chris Darramont did some work on it, and likely others. I'm kind of curious if you could, just because that seems to be a real point of interest for people tonight, if you could say how common it is for a wolf to do something like that, to seemingly well, I guess we don't know, but to seemingly, I would say, choose to live on its own. Not that we'd know those things, but what could you say about Paquet?
Well, this was unusual, and Paquet was closely watched by several people, including Cheryl, who did some long-term observations of Paquet. What I can say, it's unusual for a wolf to be alone, particularly on an island. But keep in mind that within most populations of wolves, about 10%, maybe 5 to 10% of the wolves are lone individuals, not pack members. And it doesn't mean that they might aspire to be part of a pack, but often they're not, and there might be a variety of reasons for that. So lone wolves are not unusual. I think lone wolves living on islands that are separated from the mainland by quite a distance, that's very unusual, at least in my experience.
Yeah. And Paul, just as we're starting to come to a close here, so like lots of people have asked great questions, so thank you so much for that. Like, we're sorry we can't get to them all, but we'll do our best. Paul, one thing that people have asked about is related to caribou and conservation, and I think one piece that I'm really curious of you to speak to is, and you've kind of mentioned this in the context of climate change, like wolves are highly adaptable. Like we can and we do exploit them. And even in British Columbia, we didn't go into this, but they've been effectively extirpated a couple of times, and yet they come back. And so the question is not that like wolves can sustain a lot of human pressure, but I wonder what you might say about just the ethics of this and the concept of wildlife welfare. And you know, Raincoast is a wildlife welfare ethic that thinks slightly differently. And I'm just curious if you could talk to that a little bit.
Well, just briefly, you know, this is clearly an ethical concern. And it doesn't matter that wolves are resilient. They still can suffer. They can still endure pain. And, you know, beyond that they might endure in their own natural environment that's imposed by people. And that's an ethical concern. Why we are interested in animal welfare and conservation, and that we try and blend both of those and have a keen awareness of that. And we extend that to all species, you know, that this, there are these sentient animals which have value in themselves. So it's very, very important. And this bleeds over into what we do in conservation and wildlife management. Yeah. And you know, often in conservation, our concern is mostly with populations and not individuals, but we emphasize both, and individuals are important, and we need to think about them, and we need to think about how they live and their quality of life, and how we might be affecting that quality of life. Yeah. You know, and that's important, and that's a change. And I think, you know, many people now agree with us. Others have made that point before, including Aldo Leopold. Going back, I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with Aldo Leopold. But it's an extension of ourselves, and you know, we would expect that that kind of treatment be extended towards people as well.
Yeah. Well, it seems like we're kind of at time, and I want to respect, you know, our audience here and you, Paul, in terms of the time. And it seems like an apt piece to finish on. So I'm kind of going to start to wrap here, and just say thank you to our audience for taking the time to join us tonight and the questions. We really appreciate that. Paul, I really appreciate you, period. And I really appreciate your time and effort you've put into tonight, and other colleagues at Raincoast who've made this happen, in addition to our collaborators, the Wolf Conservation Centre. If you're interested in more about wolf conservation, then please stay tuned for the rest of this series. Next week, it'll be slightly earlier, and we'll be with the Wolf Conservation Centre. So you'll actually get to meet some wolves. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more, please visit the Wolf Conservation Centre, or obviously you can visit www.raincoast.org and just look at the pictures for wolves and click on that, and you'll find a lot more information. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you, Paul. If you want it, Paul, I'm kind of curious if you have a last thought for us on wolves before we close, because I don't want to be the last one to speak.
Well, I have a last thought. I mean, just to first of all apologize for being long-winded, but I'm passionate about wolves and how we behave towards wolves and treat them. But I would just, my last thought is that you should hug a virtual wolf, and I think it's important. So, like, it was a pleasure to be here with others, and maybe we can rejoin sometime in the future. I think we could do this in different forums or in different ways, but thank you all for being here with us, and the wonderful questions as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna close the feed here, but yeah, thank you everyone again, and we hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, please take a look at our website, and we want you to learn more about wolves, and we're happy to help you do that. So thank you, and good night, everyone. Take care.
Great.
Good night. Bye-bye.